They're attacking you right now. They're taking your words, twisting their meaning, and using them as weapons against you. They want you silent. They want you obedient. And they're using language to do it.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within. The retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
How is it that over the last century, entire new categories of words have entered your language, words designed not to describe reality, but to control how you think? Who put them there? These words were inserted, carefully chosen, deliberately spread, and endlessly repeated until they became part of your reality. And once they're in your language, they're in your mind. And once they're in your mind, they own you. The infiltration of language, how they control you without you noticing. Britain was once a land where speech was open, where debate was fierce, where the right to speak your mind was sacred. Our ancestors did not fight and die so that future generations would be afraid to speak the truth. They built this nation on the foundations of courage, rebellion, and freedom. But today, they want you afraid. They want you silent. They want you to forget who you are. Language is power. It doesn't just help us communicate, it creates your thoughts, your beliefs, and dictates what you're even allowed to say. But what if I told you that many of the words you use today, the ones that define your worldview, weren't chosen by you at all? They were inserted into the system, carefully crafted, deliberately introduced, and relentlessly repeated until they became truth. This isn't the natural evolution of language, this is manipulation. This isn't new, it's been happening for centuries. The weaponization of racism. At its core, racism has traditionally been defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. For most of history, this was the accepted meaning. Racism was about individual actions, beliefs, and behaviors that treated people unfairly due to their race. But in recent decades, this definition has been quietly rewritten. Today, racism is often redefined as systemic power structures, meaning only certain groups can be racist while others cannot, regardless of their actions or beliefs. This shift was not organic, it was pushed by activists, academics, and institutions to change how society perceives race and discrimination. The result? Racism is no longer an objective concept, it has become a political weapon. Rather than creating honest discussions about human nature and understanding our differences, the modern use of racism is designed to divide. It forces people pitting groups against each other instead of encouraging critical thought and real conversations about who we are as individuals. A divided society is easier to control than a united one. And the more we focus on labels, the less we focus on the real forces influencing our lives. So, when someone accuses you of racism, what definition are they using? And more importantly, who benefits from the division? Before the 20th century, the word racism was barely used. It wasn't part of everyday language. It wasn't even a major concept. The term first appeared in the early 1900s, mostly in academic discussions about ethnic hierarchy and social Darwinism, but it had no widespread political weight. That changed when Marxists and leftist intellectuals saw its potential. They realized something: if you can't win the argument, don't debate, just attack the person. That's where Leon Trotsky comes in. In the 1920s, Trotsky began using the term racist to discredit and silence political opponents. He applied it not just to actual racial discrimination, but to anyone resisting Marxist ideology. If you opposed class struggle, revolution, or mass movements, you weren't just politically wrong, you were racist. Under Marxist regimes, resisting the ruling ideology wasn't just dangerous, it was a moral crime. If you questioned the revolution, you weren't just politically wrong, you were an enemy of progress. In Stalin's Soviet Union, this tactic was used ruthlessly. Ethnic groups like the Kalmyks were accused of nationalist tendencies and branded as traitors. Their real crime? Holding on to their cultural identity instead of fully submitting to the state's ideology. The result? mass deportations, purges, and brutal repression, all under the guise of fighting racism and nationalism. By twisting language, the Soviet regime turned resistance into bigotry and dissent into treason. If you opposed the state's vision, you weren't a free thinker, you were a dangerous reactionary. Sound familiar? Because the same playbook is being used today, right here in Britain. In modern-day Britain, nationalism is no longer seen as patriotism, it's framed as extremism. Express pride in your nation's history and you're a bigot. Question mass migration and you're a racist. Defend free speech and you're a dangerous radical. Just like in the Soviet Union, dissent isn't debated, it's labelled and silenced. The more you challenge the system, the more labels they throw at you. Just like in Soviet Russia, it's not about racism, it's about control. When words are redefined, when labels replace arguments, and when opposition is automatically equated with hatred, freedom dies. And Britain, once a bastion of free speech, is sleepwalking into the same ideological trap. The only question is, how much further will you let it go? You can track how words are inserted into society. You can track how words become popular on the internet, and when you do, you'll see it's not organic. These words didn't exist in popular culture, then suddenly spiked overnight. They weren't used naturally by people, they were pushed by institutions, media, and academia all at once. The patterns show that these words didn't catch on like slang, they were strategically placed into the system. This is how language engineering works. They don't just change how you talk, they change how you think. And once they get enough people repeating a word, it takes on a life of its own. And just like that, a new thought policing tool is born. The purpose of these new words, woke, started as a term for being aware of injustice. Now it means obey or be labelled. Conspiracy theory once meant skepticism, now it's used to silence inconvenient truths. Privilege, a way to shut people up before they can even speak. Hate speech, a vague, ever-changing term that justifies censorship and control. These words aren't neutral, they are linguistic weapons. The moment they get people to accept these words, they've won. Because once you think in their language, you play by their rules, and that's exactly what they want. How words are rewritten to serve an agenda. Language isn't just about communication, it's about control. And one of the most powerful tactics they use isn't just inventing new words, it's hijacking the ones we already had and changing their meaning.
According to MSNBC, Biden has now changed the definition of infrastructure. It can be anything you want it to be. It's hilarious, watch.
Start with, you can look up the word infrastructure in various dictionaries. Oxford says it's the basic systems and services that are necessary for a country or an organization to run smoothly. Under that definition, it can be a lot of things. So what we have here is the issue is Biden redefining infrastructure for the 21st century? Or, as Republicans say, is he sticking a lot of Democratic priorities into something and calling it an infrastructure bill?
This is what psychologists call linguistic reframing, a technique used in propaganda, advertising, and psychological warfare. The idea is simple. If you can subtly change what a word means, you can change how people think. And once they get people to accept these words, they've won. But it doesn't stop there. Because the moment you catch on, they change the words again. This is called the euphemism treadmill, and it's designed to keep you in a permanent state of uncertainty. Language isn't just being redefined, it's being constantly replaced to keep you in a state of permanent confusion. The moment society adapts to a term, they swap it out for something new. Why? Because if you're always uncertain about what words are correct, you'll be too afraid to speak at all. Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker coined the term the euphemism treadmill, describing how words that were once neutral or descriptive are constantly replaced with new, more acceptable terms, only for those new words to become offensive again later. It's a never-ending cycle of control. Crippled became handicapped, then disabled, then differently abled, then neurodiverse. Fat became overweight, then plus-sized, then body positive. Global warming became climate change, then climate crisis, then climate emergency. Illegal alien became undocumented immigrant. At first you think these changes are harmless, but then you notice a pattern. They aren't making the language more accurate, they're making it more restrictive. What's the goal? To keep you constantly adapting, constantly second-guessing, constantly unsure of what you're allowed to say. And when people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, they say nothing at all. In Maoist China, questioning the Communist Party meant you were labelled a counter-revolutionary. That word alone was enough to get you sent to a labour camp. Or worse. It wasn't about whether you actually committed a crime, it was about making sure people lived in fear of saying the wrong thing. Does that sound familiar? Today we have our own versions of these linguistic weapons, words designed to instantly silence, isolate and destroy people without debate. Bigot. Used to discredit anyone who disagrees with the dominant ideology. Extremist. Conveniently vague, yet devastatingly effective at shutting down opposition. These words don't describe, they condemn. They don't define reality, they control it. NLP, the science of reprogramming your mind. Most people assume they control their own thoughts, that they form opinions based on facts, logic, and personal experiences. But what if your thoughts are being created without your awareness? Not by facts, not by reason, by words. This is a real-world idea, this is a science, and it has a name. Neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. Developed in the 1970s by Richard Bandler and John Grinder, NLP was originally designed to understand how language shapes behavior. It was supposed to help people break bad habits, overcome fears, and change limiting beliefs, but like any powerful tool, it fell into the wrong hands. Governments, intelligence agencies, and corporations saw something else in NLP, a way to control public perception. Once they understood how language could bypass logic and directly manipulate emotions, it was weaponized, turning it into a tool of mass persuasion. And today, it's everywhere. How they are programming you without you knowing it. The way we process words isn't just about meaning, it's about emotion. Words aren't just descriptions, they trigger reactions. And if they can control those reactions, they can control you. One of the most common NLP tactics is reframing, subtly changing the meaning of words so they evoke different emotions. Ever noticed how illegal alien became undocumented immigrant? One phrase sounds like a criminal offense, the other sounds like a bureaucratic mix-up. Same reality, completely different perception. This is not random, it's deliberate, and it's only the beginning. They don't just change words, they attach them to emotions so strongly that you don't even think before reacting. It's called anchoring, and once it's set, the response becomes automatic. Ever notice how every time climate change is mentioned, it's called a climate emergency? An issue can be discussed. A crisis requires action. An emergency demands obedience. And once that emotional link is established, you don't question the narrative, you just comply. The same method is used in politics. They pick a word, anchor it to an emotion, and repeat it until you no longer think critically about it. Deadly pandemic triggers fear, and compliance, misinformation, a term designed to dismiss anything outside the official narrative. Insurrection, a word that was barely used in public discourse, suddenly repeated everywhere to frame a specific event. It's not just repetition, it's programming. Repetition is one of the most powerful tricks they use. It's not just mindless slogans, it's mantras designed to override your critical thinking. The power of mantras, why they repeat phrases over and over.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news
has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Words are powerful, but repeated words, they are hypnotic. When a phrase is repeated over and over, it bypasses critical thinking and sinks straight into the subconscious. Your brain stops questioning it and starts accepting it as truth, whether it makes sense or not. This isn't communication, it's programming. And throughout history, Every regime, every cult, and every mass movement has used this exact tactic to manipulate minds and control populations. The more you hear something, the more you believe it. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. As George Orwell warned in 1984, the purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐤, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. Another NLP trick: pattern interruption. Your brain follows predictable patterns of thinking, but if they can disrupt those patterns, they can insert new beliefs. Ever seen a politician suddenly shift tone mid-speech? One moment, they're speaking calmly, then suddenly they raise their voice, pause dramatically and stare into the camera. That's not nervousness, it's deliberate psychological manipulation. They're using pattern interruption, a classic NLP technique designed to break your normal thinking process just long enough to implant a new belief. For example, Barack Obama was a master at this. He would start slow, conversational, then suddenly pause, lean in, and hit key phrases like,
of every American whose story is not yet written. Yes, we can.
That rhythmic shift forces your brain to focus right at the moment when he implants the message. The most powerful NLP trick of all? Pacing and leading. News anchors do this every single night. They mirror your emotions, speak your frustrations, and slowly guide you toward their conclusions. After the events of January 6th, news outlets across the US all started using the same exact word: insurrection. Before that day, the term was almost never used to describe protests, but suddenly, within hours, every major network was calling it an insurrection, repeating it thousands of times.
As the dust settled, President Trump was impeached for a second time for his role in the insurrection.
As everyone knows by now, today was a day filled with surreal and horrifying scenes of armed insurrection and attempt to destroy.
Threatening the safety of duly elected officials. It's not protest, it's insurrection.
That's not organic. That's deliberate linguistic framing. By the time the public processed what had happened, the word protest was already off the table. Instead of questioning what took place, people were repeating the phrase they had been given. It's not reporting, it's persuasion. The Heaven's Gate cult when words became death. It started small. In the early 1970s, a man named Marshall Applewhite convinced a handful of people that humanity was doomed, and that the only way to escape was to leave their earthly bodies behind and ascend to a higher level of existence.
Planet Earth about to be recycled. Your only chance to evacuate is to leave with us. Planet Earth about to be recycled. Your only chance to survive or evacuate is to leave with us.
At first, it sounded absurd. The idea that a UFO was following the 𝐬𝐨𝐫𝐞 comet, waiting to rescue them, should have been laughed off. But Applewhite understood something about the human mind. If you repeat an idea enough times, people stop questioning and start accepting. He didn't just tell his followers they were special, he made them say it themselves. Day after day, they were told the world was corrupt and beyond saving. Their families and friends were trapped in lies. The media and outsiders were poisonous and trying to stop them from reaching enlightenment. And the more they repeated these ideas, the more real they became. Doubt was replaced by certainty. Certainty became fanaticism. By the 1990s, the Heaven's Gate cult had isolated itself completely. Members were required to speak in pre-approved phrases that reinforced the group's ideology. They were no longer individuals, they were part of a collective thinking with one mind. And that's when the final stage of groupthink set in. In March 1997, under Applewhite's direction, 39 members of the cult laid down in bunk beds, covered themselves with purple shrouds, and drank a lethal cocktail of phenobarbital and vodka. They didn't see it as suicide, they saw it as liberation. Why? Because they had repeated the word so many times, reality had shifted. This is what language control does. Free speech in Britain, a right that was never fully ours, Britain never had a First Amendment-style absolute right to free speech like in the United States. Instead, it was historically seen as a privilege rather than an untouchable right. Even back in the 1500s, when Parliament claimed the right to free speech, it only applied inside Parliament itself. The public? Not so much. The Bill of Rights, 1689, enshrined this principle further, but it was always about protecting politicians, not ordinary people. Fast forward a few hundred years and free speech in the UK became more of a cultural norm than a legal protection. The assumption was that in a free country, speech should be free. But assumptions can be dangerous, because while Britain never guaranteed free speech, it absolutely knew how to take it away. The laws that quietly took your voice. In modern Britain, Article 10 of the Human Rights Act 1998 claims to guarantee freedom of expression. Unfortunately, it also allows necessary restrictions in the name of protecting public order, national security, and the rights of others. That means your speech is only free until someone in power decides it isn't. And over time, those necessary restrictions expanded into a web of laws that now dictate what you can and can't say. The Malicious Communications Act, 1988. Makes it illegal to send messages that are grossly offensive or indecent. That sounds fair, right? Except the definition of offensive is completely subjective. The Public Order Act 1986 criminalises speech that might stir up hatred. No need for intent, just the possibility that someone might interpret your words that way. The Terrorism Act 2006 criminalises speech that could be seen as glorifying terrorism. Sounds reasonable until you realise it's been used against journalists, activists, and even historians discussing historical conflicts. And then came the biggest blow of all, the Online Safety Act 2023, the death of free speech in the digital age. If you think censorship only happens in dictatorships, think again. The Online Safety Act 2023 was marketed as a way to protect people from online abuse and misinformation. But what it really did was hand over speech regulation to unelected bureaucrats and tech giants. Now, social media platforms are legally required to remove harmful content, even if it's not illegal. And who decides what's harmful? Not you, not the courts, but experts and regulators with their own political and ideological biases. This means post an opinion that challenges the mainstream narrative, possibly removed. Make a joke someone finds offensive, you could be censored. Question government policy, possibly shadow banned. And it's not just what you say, it's what you don't say. Under this new system, silence can be incriminating. If you refuse to use preferred pronouns, if you question certain ideologies, if you fail to affirm the right ideas, you can be accused of causing harm. The result? A climate of fear. Self-censorship. People watching their words not because they believe in what they're saying, but because they're afraid of the consequences. A system designed to confuse and control. The worst part? These laws are deliberately vague. They don't tell you exactly what you can or can't say, because uncertainty is the point. If the rules aren't clear, you'll police yourself out of fear. What does offensive mean? Who defines harmful speech? When does debate become hate? No one knows. And that's how they want it. Because a society that's confused about what's allowed is a society that learns to shut up and comply. Britain has reached a point where speech is no longer free. It's managed. It's not about protecting people, it's about controlling narratives. It's not about stopping hate, it's about silencing dissent. And if you don't believe it's happening, just ask the people arrested. Arrest of a 9-year-old for name-calling. A 9-year-old child was investigated by police for calling a classmate a derogatory term, leading to a recorded non-crime hate incident. Conviction for posting. Rap lyrics. Chelsea Russell, a teenager from Liverpool, was prosecuted for posting rap lyrics containing racial slurs on her Instagram as a tribute to a deceased friend. She was found guilty of sending a grossly offensive message. Prosecution for teaching a dog a salute. Mark Meechan, known online as Count Dankula, was convicted for posting a video where he trained his girlfriend's pug to perform a salute as a joke. He was fined £800 for being grossly offensive. This is Britain in 2025. Free speech is either free or it's dead. The only way to win this war on language is to refuse to submit. Your ancestors built this nation with blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They fought for freedom, not just for themselves, but for you. They stood against kings, empires, and tyrants who tried to silence them. Now it's your turn. They control you with words, but only if you let them. The first step is simple. Stop playing the game. Stop using their language. Refuse to speak in terms designed to control you. Don't say hate speech, call it what it is, an excuse for censorship. Don't say misinformation, say a viewpoint they fear. Don't say equity, expose it as forced inequality. The moment you reject their words, you reclaim your own voice. Because language is not just a tool, it's a battlefield. And when you stop fighting on their terms, you start winning. But rejecting their words is not enough. We must restore the truth. That means reviving old words that gave us power. Words like free thought, dissent, truth seeker, sovereignty. Words they're buried because they made people think for themselves. And more than that, we must create new words. Words that expose their manipulation. Start using terms like speech shaming when they make you afraid to speak. Call it truth laundering when the media twists facts to fit their agenda. Name it word washing when they redefine language to deceive you. Once enough people use these words, they become real, and reality is what they fear the most. But words alone will not win this fight. The only way to win this is to stop playing by their rules. They control speech to control thought. Don't let them. Stop using their words. Call things what they are. Censorship is censorship, not hate speech regulation. A banned opinion isn't misinformation. It's something they don't want you to hear. But words alone aren't enough. Push back within the law, challenge bans, file complaints, demand accountability. They expect silence. Give them lawful opposition. Support independent voices, have real conversations, build communities where speech is truly free. This is our country, our history, our future. Free speech built Britain, and we won't be the generation that lets it die. They want us weak, they want us afraid, they want us silent, but we are British, and we will never be silent.